and all of those who walk in his path with excellence until the last day. So alhamdulillah, we're in our second session of this text by Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, al-Imam Abu Hāmid al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah ta'ala. And we are still kind of in the introduction of the text, one can say. So he had just talked about how he was looking into each one of these different groups, and he points out that in his investigation of these different groups, whether they are the esotericists, the Batiniya or the Ismailiyya, or the philosophers, or the Sufis, or the Mutakallimun, that he was doing so in a way that was sincere. Like, it wasn't simply him trying to read through their source texts in order to refute them or to argue with them, but rather that he was confronting these texts in a way where he was hoping, in a sense, that the truth would be would somehow manifest itself through the things that he was reading. And this is what we were talking about as being a sincere engagement or an honest engagement of that which you are trying to investigate. And one can say that this is obviously what we would expect somebody to do if they're reading, our books, right? If you talk to a non-Muslim, you would hope that the way in which they would engage these texts would be in a sincere fashion. If you find that there is going to be truth in this, that you would hold yourself accountable to that, and that you're coming to it with an open mind. And so if we're asking people to do that when it comes to our tradition, then we shouldn't be hypocritical when we go about engaging other people's tradition. So he talks about the different groups, and we kind of we reached the last group that he talks about. So قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلمه في الدارين آمين. He says ولا زنديقا معطلا إلا وأتجسس وراءه لتنبه لأسبابه أو لأسباب جرأته في تعطيل وزندقته. So this last group that he talks about are the Zanadiqa or the Mu'attila. So he says, if one of the Zanadiqa or the Mu'attila, I would look beneath the surface so that I could discover the reasons for their adoption of the creeds that they hold. Now, the Zindiq, that word, generally speaking, means kafir, basically, or heretic, or unbeliever. And Mu'attil, i.e., is one who assumedly forgoes affirming God. Like, they deny the existence of God or any of the attributes. So, and they thought of themselves as sort of free thinkers in the time period, one can kind of imagine. And you see certain trends of that still till this day. But you also find that the term Zindiq was used to talk about the Manichaeans, who are those who affirmed a kind of dualism towards God, or a dualistic nature to God. So there was the God of light, they would say, and the God of darkness, or the God of good and the God of evil. And that was obviously to try and parse some of the implications of why there is evil in the world. Right? So he says that I'm even looking at these individuals who are current during his time and trying to understand where they're coming from when it comes to the things that they're actually saying. وقد كان التعطش إلى درك حقائق الأمور دأبي وديدني من أول أمري وريعان عمري غريزة وفطرة من الله تعالى وضعها في جبلتي لا باختياري وحيلتي لا باختياري وحيلتي. It's a very important point. So he says that to thirst after comprehending things as they really are was a habit of mine and a custom from when I was really young. Like, it was part of me. He says it was instinctive. It was a fitri aspect of me, sort of part of my God-given or primordial disposition. And also as a matter of my temperament, like my personality, and not of my own choosing. And so what's interesting about this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given people different temperaments, We've actually talked about temperaments in general. God has created some people who are more inclined to reasoning, one can say, and they like to learn through a type of dialectic means. So they don't just take things without some discursive manner, right? Like I have a friend of mine, for instance, who he has to argue in order to learn anything. um, and it's actually not him. I mean, some people take it the wrong way. They think like, why are you always arguing with me? For him, it's actually the way he learns. So it's part of his personality. Okay. And then some who are more inclined towards experience and kind of an experiential knowledge. Like they have to do things and, as they say, get their feet wet in order to really understand it. Like I have a 2-year-old now at home, and what's interesting is that he's not really the type of person who has to always go learn things that way, but you see at times like that's just what he's going to do. You can tell him no, and he's still going to go do it because he doesn't get it. So there are those people as well. Like they have to have the experience to really understand what's going on. Then there are some people who are more inclined towards their impressions and their feelings towards things. The important part is that one cannot say that there's one that's better and one that's worse. Right? They're just different. And the only difference that we can say is going to, allow one to be better than the other is simply on the merit of how those qualities are being used to both arrive at truth and then actually practice the things that we know are true. That's it. So there are some people who are going to be able to do this, and some people, given the qualities that they're given, and there are others who may struggle with it, and it's not because of the particular quality in and of itself, but rather the way in which they are using those things, those God-given qualities. So you also have people who are much more conformist in their disposition, okay? Like what you tell them, they just kind of listen. And really, when I think about Ahmad, my son right now, that's kind of the way he is. Or they learn from other people. Like they'll see things happening and they'll learn from that, and that'll be sufficient for them as well. But that doesn't take away the fact that he'll get really, really mad if you tell him no. Like, he won't do it, but he'll throw his shoe at the television or something. Like, just wants to let you know, like, I'm not doing this, but I'm really mad about this whole situation. And then those who don't, I mean, for them, there are those who have to investigate, the things that they're doing. Now, one of the wisdoms in Allah's creation is that we see this basic binary in most things. And even, for example, when you examine the madhahib, like the 4 schools of Sunni legal thought, okay? Some ask, well, why are there 4? Like, what's the reason for 4? What's interesting is that there were actually more than 4, but they sort of condensed down into 4. And the dominant traits seem to have been subsumed in these 4. So the basic binary that we see is that you have what are known as Ahl al-Hadith and then Ahl al-Ra'i. And depending on your orientation towards those terms, it's going to differ as to what you think those terms actually mean. But generally speaking, we can say that one is much more inclined to reasoning and investigation, and then one is more inclined towards a kind of strictly conforming to scripture, or their disposition is something that is more scriptural. And in between them are those who try and provide a more equal usage of both. Like, they try and bring both of them into play. And what we find is that they're still going to lean towards one more than the other. So one may lean further towards reasoning than they do the other, and one leans more towards hadith than the other. What's important is that all 4 of them are not simply using one or the other, but that there are kind of degrees in where we see the usage of those 2 basic techniques. All right. And in many ways, for those who study the basic orientations of the madhabs, you'll find that your personality seems to fit into one of them over other. So, and this is the way that Islam, as a system of life for all people and places and times, accommodates for the complexities that go into the human experience, holistically speaking. Right? And the same goes for theology, like the theological schools, and for spirituality. And Imam al-Ghazālī rahimahullah ta'ala will actually speak more to that issue as we continue. So he says, حتى انحلت عني رابطة التقليد وانكسرت علي العقائد الموروثة على قرب عهد بسن السباء. إذا رأيت صبيان النصارى لا يكون لهم نشوء إلا على التنصر، وصبيان اليهود لا نشوء لهم إلا على التهود، وصبيان المسلمين لا نشوء لهم إلا على الإسلام. وسمعت الحديث المروي عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حيث قال: كل مولود يولد على الفطرة فأبواه يهودانه أو ينصرانه أو يمجسانه. فتحرك باطني إلى طلب حقيقة الفطرة الأصلية وحقيقة العقائد العارضة بتقليد الوالدين والأستاذين، والتميز بين هذه التقليدات، وأوائلها تلقينات، وفي تمييز الحق منها عن الباطل اختلافات. So he says that after saying that there was a sort of instinctive element within him that caused him to go into an investigation rather than just simply wanting to believe that which had been passed down to him. So he says, I drew near to, but when he reached the age of adolescence, to getting rid of this sort of blind following or taqleed, right? The kind of conformist trend that one has where you just follow that which the authorities in your life give you, and inherited beliefs, right, that I was given had lost their grip on me. And he says, I saw that Christian children always grew up to be Christians. And I saw that Jewish children always grew up to be Jews. And I saw that Muslim children always grew up to be Muslims. And I heard also the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said that every newborn is born with a primordial disposition, fitrah. And it's his parents who make him a Jew or a Christian or a Magian. So then he says, so I was moved to discover, what is this fitrah? Like, what is it really? And what the beliefs derived from the authority of parents and teachers really were. And then he says the attempts to distinguish between these authority-based opinions and their principles was also something that he wanted to understand. And to distinguish the truth in them from the falsehood in them showed that there were actually differences of opinion when it came to these things. So Ghazālī points out here a few things. Through the prophetic tradition, and we've all probably heard this tradition before, كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. Every newborn is born in fitrah, this primordial disposition. And what this really means actually is that one has the capacity to recognize truth for truth. Okay, there's a disposition for you as a human being to conform to that which is true. And so he says we're all born with this primordial disposition, and then it becomes corrupted by false religions. So what Ghazālī is going to ask to begin with is, what is this fitrah that we're all born with? And like, how do I understand its role? Secondly, investigating the way in which this comes into engaging beliefs that we inherit from our families and what we're taught by teachers and authority figures growing up. So it's not actually a detailed analysis of like child development and early learning, but the general frameworks actually seem to be there. So he wants to understand like cognitive development, general learning competencies, and like put them into conversation with emotional or psychospiritual development. Okay. So, you know, it will turn into an epistemological question, but from here, he really wants to understand how to explore that which would distinguish between these inherited beliefs. So like if I'm a Muslim and I grew up believing whatever because my parents told me whatever, and the Christian across, my neighbor who's Christian also grew up in that same fashion, but just with Christianity, is there a difference between us? Like, can we say that there's some sort of fundamental difference between us? And what are the principles that we're using to come into these realizations? And then he says, to try and discern truth from falsehood on these matters, in other words, to try to figure out what's going on here, and what's true and what's false, I found that there were differences of opinion. Like the scholars actually differed in their understanding of these things. All right. So then he says, فقلت في نفسي أولا إنما مطلوبي العلم بحقائق الأمور فلا بد من طلب حقيقة العلم ما هي. إنما مطلوبي العلم بحقائق الأمور فلا بد من طلب حقيقة العلم ما هي. So he says that after coming to an understanding that there are differences of opinion in some of the things that I initially tried to understand, I said, well, to begin with, what I'm actually looking for is knowledge of what things really are. So I really should try and find an understanding of what knowledge actually is. And then he says, فظهر لي أن العلم اليقيني هو الذي ينكشف فيه المعلوم انكشافا لا يبقى معه ريب ولا يقارنه إمكان الغلط والوهم ولا يتسع القلب لتقرير ذلك بل الأمان من الخطأ ينبغي أن يكون مقارنا لليقين مقارنة لو تحدى بإظهار بطلانه مثلا من يقلب الحجر ذهبا والعصا ثعبانا لم يورث ذلك شكا وإمكانا. It's a very interesting point here. So let's parse this. So what he says first and foremost is, I realized it was plain to me that certain knowledge is that type of knowledge where the object is disclosed in such a fashion that no doubt could coexist with it, and that no possibility of error or some illusion could accompany it, and that the mind can't even entertain that type of position. So then he says certain knowledge must be infallible, one can say, going back to infallibility here. In other words, it's got to be free from error. All right. And so he says, and this security from error is such that no attempt to show the falsehood of that knowledge could cause you to doubt it or to deny it. Even though the attempt that's made by someone who turns, for instance, he gives an example, who turns stones into gold or a stick into a snake could do it. So he says, and this is something that needs to be parsed. Okay. What does he mean by all of this? So we know he's looking at the definition of knowledge. The ulama actually have a number of definitions when it comes to knowledge. What is knowledge? And in our course on Imam al-Sunusi, we actually looked at this question to some extent. Fakhruddin al-Razi rahimahullah ta'ala actually gave a standard definition, one can say, of knowledge within the tradition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And he says that knowledge is a hukum jazim mutabiq lil-waqi' li-mujib. It's a certain judgment or belief that corresponds to reality and with some proof or evidence that is attached to it. Okay. And that evidence is resolute or is certain. Now, when the ulama look at knowledge, they parse knowledge into two types. They say that there is ilm daruri and ilm nadari. There's evident or non-inferential knowledge, and then there is nadari, inferential knowledge. Daruri knowledge is, say for instance, something like your existence. Do you know that you exist? Yes, it's daruri. It's self-evident. Or they'll say that one is half of two. So these are known as non-inferential truths. That there are truths that are known in themselves and are things that anyone can clearly discern. Inferential or nadari truths are one that are acquired by means of inference and reflection. Okay, so an example of inferential truths are that they require some thought, some reflection, and quite possibly an explanation or demonstration of its truth so that it can become discernible for somebody. So Imam Sunusi, rahimahullah ta'ala, for instance, says that an example of this is that one is half of a sixth of 12. So in order for one to know what the answer to that proposition is, it's not self-evident. It doesn't happen simply from my saying the actual the equation in and of itself. You have to reflect and you have to think about it. Okay, so sixth of 12, 2, and then half of that. Oh yeah, it's 1. Okay. Now, inferential knowledge makes up the overwhelming bulk of knowledge or disciplines that we're all engaging in or specializing in to some degree. So when we look at inferential knowledge, they are also further divided into degrees of epistemic value. Okay. Epistemic value, what does that mean? Why does this guy use all these really crazy words all the time? In other words, the degree to which we know something can differ. Like the degree to which I know I exist can differ in relationship to the degree that I know that, you know, my children are downstairs. Okay. So we can have yaqeen, and yaqeen means complete certainty in something. It's 100%. I have 100% conviction of a thing, i.e. there is no way that it could be wrong. There's no potential in it being anything other than that. That's what we mean when we say yaqeen or certainty of a thing. And then you have what's known as dhann, okay, or probabilistic knowledge, which varies in its degree, but never reaches 100%, one can say. All right, so from 51% up forward, but before 100%, one can say that that's probabilistic knowledge. Now, the majority of our disciplines work on probabilistic means because things that denote complete certainty are like far and few between. It's really difficult actually to derive yaqeen in a matter. But when it comes to theology and doctrinal beliefs, the ulama say that they have to be things that assert that degree of certainty, i.e. that they are 100%. Whereas when it comes to fiqh or matters of religious practice, see, like I have yaqeen, for instance, that my kid just screamed. So when it comes to doctrine, like I said before, yaqeen, they have to be 100% certain. Your creedal doctrines have to be 100% certain. But when it comes to fiqh or matters of religious praxis, the scholars say that you don't have to have that degree of certainty. And why? Because it's based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that many of us have heard before, where the Prophet ﷺ informs the Sahaba to go to Bani Qurayza and to not pray Asr until they arrive there. A group of them en route say, listen, it's about to Asr is actually about to expire and we're about to move into Maghrib and we need to pray. And the other group said, no, the Prophet ﷺ said, don't pray until we reach Bani Qurayza. There was a difference. What did the Prophet mean when it came to this issue? A group of them said, no, that's not what he meant. He meant, to hurry up and get there, but that there are prescribed times for these prayers and we should pray them in their prescribed times. And the other group differed. One of the groups prayed it, the other group didn't until they got there. And when they got back, the Prophet ﷺ actually informed them that both of them were in the right. Right? In other words, that they derived that which they derived based on sound knowledge and tried to extrapolate from what the Prophet had said in the best way possible. And that both of them are actually modalities that one can take. All right. So, in other words, probabilistic knowledge is sufficient for them when it comes to matters of religious praxis. But in a certain sense, too, one has to say this, because sometimes people hear this and they think, oh yeah, see, Sheikh said we can do whatever we want when it comes to fiqh. That's not what I'm saying, all right? Or that fiqh's not important or something. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Because fiqh is still actually yaqini knowledge from a particular perspective. Like there's a certain sense in where we still think of our religious praxis as a matter of certainty. Why? Because it derives itself from a universal knowledge, which is in fact 100%. And that is kalam, i.e. our doctrinal beliefs. And that's the reason why Imam al-Ghazālī rahimahullah ta'ala in the Mustasfa says that ilm al-kalam is al-ilm al-kulli, the universal knowledge, and all of the other knowledges derive their basic axioms from that knowledge, i.e. that they're building themselves on the foundations of kalam. And so, that shows you in many ways Imam al-Ghazālī's disposition towards kalam, but we're going to look at that more in this text. And that how all of this actually is constituted as one body. So when we speak of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, fiqh, theology, and spirituality in Islam, we think of them in separate categories, and obviously they have different considerations or modes of analyses, but one also has to understand that we're still talking about Islam as a whole here, and that they all build on one another at some level. Okay, so then he says, فَإِنِّي إِذَا عَلَمْتُ, then this is very important, by the way. So, فَإِنِّي إِذَا عَلِمْتُ أَنَّ الْعَشْرَةَ أَكْثَرُ مِنَ الثَّلَاثَةِ فَلَوْ قَالَ لِي قَائِلٌ لَا بَلْ الثَّلَاثَةُ أَكْثَرُ مِنَ الْعَشْرَةِ بدليل أني أقلب هذه العصا ثعبانا وقلبها وشهدت ذلك منه لم أشك بسببه في معرفتي ولم يحصل لي منه إلا التعجب من كيفية قدرته عليه فأما الشك فيما علمته فلا ثم علمت أن كل ما لا أعلمه على هذا الوجه ولا أتيقنه هذا النوع من اليقين فهو علم لا ثقة به ولا أمان معه وكل علم لا أمان معه فليس بعلم يقيني. Okay, so he says that certain knowledge, as we said before, has to have, it cannot be, it has to be safeguarded from being false in any way, shape, or form, or being doubted in any way, shape, or form. So he says, thus, I know that 10 is more than 3. And this is something that I just, it's absolutely true with certainty. So he says, let me suppose that someone says to me, no, actually 3 is more than 10. And the proof that 3 is more than 10, as this person says, is that I'm going to change this rod into a serpent. And let us suppose that he actually does change the rod into a serpent, and that I witness him doing so. He says, no doubts about what I know are raised in me because of this. I have absolutely no doubt in the thing that I still know. The only result, the only thing that, issue here is that I begin to wonder, how was he able to do this? But of doubting my knowledge, though, there's absolutely none of that. And so after these reflections, I knew that whatever I don't know in this fashion, whatever I don't have knowledge of in this fashion, and with this mode of certainty, is not reliable, is not reliable or not safeguarded from doubt, from being doubted. A knowledge that is not safeguarded from being doubted is not certain knowledge. So this is a very important point. Okay, and it's going to come up again later as well. Yaqini knowledge, certain knowledge, is not telling you why something simply is the way that it is. It's telling you why that thing has to be that way. So much so, as al-Ghazālī points out here, that there could be nothing that could shake that understanding or deny that which is known. And so he says, even if some guy came and told you otherwise, and he was able to somehow substantiate this claim with a miracle, like with a mu'jiza, and it's interesting that mu'jiza actually comes from ijaz, which means like to render something like to incapacitate, In other words, that you become kind of incapacitated by that which you saw. It still would not have the power to make you deny the thing that you know with yaqeen. So in other words, Imam al-Ghazālī here is showing us that the merit of one's understanding a thing vis-a-vis the intellect, okay, where it provides the knower of that thing with certain knowledge, is extremely important. And we'll come to look at this more later, because you have people still today who are trying to argue that Ghazālī rejected the capacity of the aql, the intellect, to ascertain certainty. But it's quite clear that he's already building a construct that would affirm the capacity of the mind to have certain knowledge of a thing. All right? In other words, I know what I know as a sort of mode of certainty, i.e. that 10 is more than 3. This is daruri knowledge. I have absolute certainty of it. It's a necessary truth, one can say. And there's nothing that you can do to get me to not believe that. You can perform any miracle you want. It's not going to shake my belief in this particular thing. All right? Now, this is very important for a number of reasons. What Ghazālī wants to show here with this is that emotionally committing oneself to a thing before you've substantiated whether or not that thing is true or not is a huge mistake. So correcting your world outlook through rational means is extremely important. So for example, I'll give you an example of this. Okay, I have a friend who, so a while back, met someone who he was, thinking about marrying. And before he or her actually thought about whether or not, this makes sense, one can say, they emotionally committed themselves to each other. Now, there are a whole number of red flags from the get-go. And when he came to me as a friend, asked me about this issue, I told him there are a whole number of red flags, and I was wondering, was he going to bring these things up or not? And he said, no, it's going to happen in its due time and whatever. He didn't feel like it was that time period yet. Now, he emotionally committed to it. These things come back, and you begin to realize that your commitment to this person now, within this emotional manner, has caused you to put yourself in a situation where, the ends don't justify the means anymore. And this is something that I know many people in our community are suffering from. Okay. And what Imam al-Ghazālī here is actually saying, and becomes kind of a principle that we should think about, is that before you commit yourself to anything emotionally, you have to rationally ground the veracity of that thing that you're doing. Now, there are some things that it's not that easy. We're not talking about truth or false when it comes to everything, right? But simply, making sense of a particular situation to say, look, does it even make sense for me to get involved at that level? Okay. That's something that has to be done through rational means before one emotionally commits to it. And what Imam al-Ghazālī here is also implicating is that this these two things, number one, correcting one's outlook and then emotionally committing oneself to that thing, oftentimes are reversed, right? Where you're emotionally committing yourself to something and then trying to justify it rationally somehow, okay? And he's saying that this is not going to work. It's going to cause a whole slew of problems. And we see how this is causing a massive amount of problems, particularly when we talk about people's religion and what they've adopted in terms of their religion, because they have such an affinity towards that religion. They've emotionally committed themselves to something before thinking about, well, is this thing that I'm doing, are these practices, this whole way of thinking about the world, is it true or not? Before I get caught up in actually committing myself to it on this level, I should be thinking about that question. Is it true or is it not true? All right. And this includes, by the way, spiritual experiences as well. Like one can have a greatly deep spiritual experience, but the mind has a way of saying, well, you are hallucinating. And that would actually be sufficient to dispel the experience, and especially if they're difficult to believe, if that experience is very difficult for one to fathom. So in other words, yaqeen in anything will be shaky unless it has rational grounding. But if I can say, well, those other things that I know to be true, i.e. rationally are true, make sense, then these types of experiences, spiritual or otherwise, could potentially be happening all the time. And there's actually nothing strange about it whatsoever, that I really did experience those things that I felt. And there's nothing weird about it. Why? Because I've come to understand through a sound investigation of these doctrines that this is something that can potentially happen. It's possible. And I mean, sometimes people see things that are physical experiences, and they are so unexpected from that person's actual experiences that they just reject them flat out. All right. So rational grounding becomes something that is extremely important, and you can see this being alluded to by Imam al-Ghazālī. Now, so what's important here is that if a claim is based on certain evidence and it corresponds to reality, it's called ilm. It's called knowledge, ilm. If it's not, okay, if it's not based on evidence or corresponds to reality, it's called jahl, ignorance. If you're 50-50 on the matter, it's called shak. It's inconclusive. If you're confident but you're not certain, then it's called dhann, probabilistic. And if it's unlikely, it's called wahm, doubt. Okay. Now you also may have a person who doesn't have knowledge of a thing, and like we said before, this is called jahl. But on top of that, they don't have knowledge that they don't have knowledge of that thing. You follow me? Okay, and that's called jahl murakkab, compound ignorance. So in other words, simply to say, I don't know, like I'm ignorant of a particular matter, that's not like a bad thing, by the way. It's actually a really good thing. Your ability to know that you don't know something is really good. And as you know, the ulama say, like la adri is half of knowledge. Imam Malik, for instance, has a quotation with that where la adri, I don't know, is half of knowledge. And what that means ultimately is that it's in your ability to recognize those things that you do not know that allows you to learn, that allows you to grow. Otherwise, what are you doing? So in order for you to actually be someone who is growing and learning and coming to a real proper understanding of knowledge, it first takes a type of humility in order for you to say, I don't know something, and to be very, very clear about that with yourself and with maybe the people around you. Whereas somebody who, and so this is something that ultimately we say is a good thing, right? Whereas somebody who doesn't know, but they don't know that they don't know, i.e. they act like they do know. This is a really bad state, because in order for you to climb out of all of that, it takes a lot. right? As they say, some of the shuyukh, to fill a cup of water that's already full, you're not doing anything. And so it really takes a type of humility in order to empty that cup, in order for you to fill it with that which is going to help you grow. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be people of humility and growth. So, and there's like sort of confidence scale. And in one of the recent classes that we had taught at the Majlis, we went through this confidence scale. So the different degrees of knowledge of a thing, okay? So you can have, like we said before, yaqeen, which is 100% certainty, dhann, assumption or probability. One can say that this is like 75%, okay? You're confident, you're not really certain though. 50-50, shak, it's inconclusive. Below that you have doubt, wahm, something is unlikely. And then from there is jahl, and then from there you also have jahl murakkab. All right. Any questions about any of this? Now, what's interesting is that Imam al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah ta'ala, is also going to show that certainty, i.e. that one can arrive at certainty, okay, through rational inquiry and the ascents that one makes, but that certainty in and of itself may not be sufficient to get one to actually practice those things that they know. And so there are degrees, as Imam Ghazali will talk about, of certainty. There are degrees of certainty that you can actually climb the ladder of certainty in and of itself, and where now you have a type of ilm that goes beyond simply a rational affirmation of a thing or a rational assent of a thing. And this is what Imam al-Ghazali is going to show he was really after. Okay, so we now enter into the section on al-qawl fi madakhil al-safsafta wa jahd al-ulum. So the term that he brings up, skepticism, right, or sophistry, and the denial of all knowledge. Okay, safsata, sophistry, goes back to sophists who emerged actually from the Greek intellectual tradition as highly skilled rhetoricians. And they're also dialecticians as well. But the idea for them was that there is no one truth. Like anything or nearly anything could be argued for in a way that brought about truth. And so the primary purpose was simply to win the dispute, find any way to win the dispute. And so they came up with moves that helped them do that. Okay. The modern usage of the term and the way that the ulama deploy it is the use of a fallacious argument, often deliberately and with the intention of deceiving someone. So it's a deceptive form of logic and based in logical fallacy. And we still see them. Oftentimes, you listen to many politicians, you will hear this stuff all day. One that we still hear a lot actually is the fallacy of equivocation. So you use the same term with various meaning in each point of the syllogism, right? This is done a lot. Now, there were various types of sophists, and they also mention them in the books. Okay, so you have what are known as al-Indiyya, and they were those who say that there is no capital T truth, but that there are relative truths. So Fouad has a truth, and Zareen has a truth, and Firas has a truth, and we all just have, you ask these people and they just have their truth, but there is no big T truth. We call them relativists. Okay. Al-Inadiyya. Al-Inadiyya are those who say that there is no modality to truth at all. Okay, so these are just skeptics. And then lastly, you have what are known as La Adriya. And the La Adriya are a type of agnostics or agnosticism, which is the view that the existence of truth is either unknown or unknowable. Okay. Now, these particular dispositions, what's really interesting is that these dispositions you can see even, in the 11th century. And so we think of them today as like, you know, wow, these really brilliant people who came up with this stuff, and like, you know, it's unprecedented or something. No, there's precedent. There's been people who have had these ideas from the get-go, and the way that the ulama work with these sort of universal concepts in order for us to be able to apply them to the particulars of almost every time period, you know, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them the best of the next abode for this, because it helps us as Muslims be able to understand what's going on relative to, one can say, our own experiences. There are many people today who talk about truth in this sort of relativistic way, and they really do believe that there is no, you know, capital T truth. They should read this book, inshallah. Now, of course, the Muslim scholars operated on the basis of first principles. Okay, so in Imam Taftazani's sharh of, it's a commentary on the Nasafi Creed, the first line says that حقائق الأشياء ثابتة, that, you know, the things are real, and we affirm the essences of things. In other words, a thing is a thing, right? What's known as the law of identity. So first principle, and these are part of our first principles. First principles are things that distinguish the universal and necessary attributes of a thing that you're interested in. Okay, so for example, when we say all dogs are animals, okay, knowing that this is true is a first principle. Now, these are also known in the textbooks as the classical laws of knowledge, and they are the law of identity that I just said. A thing is what it is. Okay, and you may be thinking to yourself, like, for real, like we came to Fouad's class for him to tell me that a thing is what it is. You know this stuff, and this is part of just your it's intuitive, it's axiomatic. You were born with this, and this is what we mean, by the way, with fitra. Your fitra is very much in tune to this stuff. You don't have to be told it, but in order for us to lay all of this out in sort of academic fashion to see where other people's arguments have gone awry, it's really important to know this stuff. So the law of identity is the first one. It's telling you that a thing is what it is. The law of contradiction is that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time. In other words, if I say X, you know, is X and not X at the same time, that's a contradiction, right? Can't have that. And then you have the law of excluded middle. So it's every proposition is either true or false, and there is no third alternative, right? So everything has a determinate truth value, one can say. And this becomes extremely important, obviously, for Muslims insofar as understanding what are those universals, those first principles that we are going to base our understanding on in order for us to come to a realization of what truths are actually out there. Okay, so these three in particular become foundational to the way that we think. And again, when you look up the classical laws of logic, you will find that it wasn't simply just Muslims who held these beliefs, but the bulk of the entirety of the world in the pre-modern period understood this. And it isn't until really the Enlightenment where you begin to have a domination of this sort of sophist way of thinking about the world predominate over the other alternatives now. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, ثم فتشت عن علومي فوجدت نفسي عاطلة عن علم موصوف بهذه الصفة إلا في الحسيات والضروريات. And we'll end here. So we got into the section on sophistry, inshallah, and we'll get through it. But he says, so I investigated the various kinds of knowledge that I had, and I found myself destitute of all knowledge with this characteristic of infallibility, or, you know, not being able to doubt, except in the case of sense perception and necessary truths. Okay. In other words, when it comes to my ability to actually know for certain particular things, Imam al-Ghazālī is saying that I only knew them insofar as sense perception is concerned. I exist, I can see them in myself. And what he calls necessary truths, i.e., axiomatic or intuitive truths, self-evident truths. And we'll talk about, again, what those things are and how they relate to the different categories of knowledge. But you can begin to see now the way in which Imam Ghazali is going to carry out this investigation. Right? He wants to know from the very get-go, how are we going to properly discern truth, and whether or not that's going to be, whether or not we can actually do that or not. And the way to begin is to look at these individuals who seem to have a different point of view, and to investigate, well, where are they coming from, and what exactly are they saying? Is it true? Is it not true? And inshallah, we'll continue next week to see kind of where he lands on all of this. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions, comments? And the Sophists are actually a really, the fact that he's beginning with them also shows a lot of, there's, like I said before, when you hear people argue today, and you realize how much sophistry is actually being used. You have like this really eloquent rhetoric or very passionate way of speaking, but when you actually parse what they're actually saying, like the content of what is actually being said, you realize that there's no substance here. As a matter of fact, it's just hogwash. There's no reality to any of it. And so much of the world that we live in today has become completely infested with this particular way of doing things. We as Muslims, and particularly Muslims who are extremely well educated, and people who have college degrees, as far as our tradition is concerned, these are well educated people. And yet for some reason don't know this, also shows how backwards everything is in the modern period. So we have to learn this stuff, and inshallah, I think I'm trying to teach it as basic as possible in the way that Imam Ghazali is presenting it. But it's very important, particularly in the time period that we live, to have a grasp on all of this, inshallah.
So, Sheikh, one question.
Yeah.
You had mentioned there's 3 groups within the Sophists. Are these skeptics, agnostics, and what were the third ones?
Relativists.
Relativists.
Yeah.
Okay. And is the text going to go dissect each of them? Or?
No, I mean, I gave you kind of a bit of a commentary on the Sophists, just so that we can understand the context that Imam al-Ghazali is confronting and who these people are. And by the way, there's more to it than just that. These are general frameworks.
Okay.
Yeah, but what Imam al-Ghazali really wants to try and discern for himself is, as he said before, I know that anything that is known without anything that I can call knowledge that itself is susceptible to doubt could not be called knowledge. It's not certain knowledge. And so for me, what I'm after is, an understanding of this epistemological framework, and to see, well, what are the things that are out there that one can absolutely know? And so in doing so, he is going to now begin kind of his investigation into this epistemological framework by, in many ways, kind of testing it. Okay. And this is also very important, and I don't want to jump the gun here, so don't let me do this. but it's very important because for those who have studied philosophy, we know that Descartes has a type of experience where he kind of doubts everything, and as a matter of fact, he falls into a complete doubt of everything. some want to read into this tradition that that is what happened to Ghazali. Okay. And so going back to that question that I think UCD had posited, what, when we think about these concepts and the way that Imam al-Ghazali, for instance, was engaging these different things, how should we understand his engagement with, say, philosophy, or some of the epistemological tools that he was investigating insofar as the skeptics or the sophists in general, relative to the way that he engaged a science like tasawwuf or kalam or something like that. And it becomes very clear, if you understand Ghazali holistically, that there were things that he himself engaged in as someone who was a practitioner of that thing, and then others that he explored in the sense of trying to understand what it is. Okay. And to really test it to see the durability, like, does this actually work or not? Without resorting to him having to actually go through that experience himself in a way now that says, oh, Ghazali basically became an atheist and then came back to Islam later. Like, no, that's not what happened. Okay. And the reason why I say people read that narrative into Ghazali is because of the reading of Descartes and how similar some of these things are in the way in which the Western tradition has explored some of these concepts in that particular modality, and then saying, well, this happened to Muslims as well. We can see it in the story of Ghazali. So he's basically just doing what Descartes did. So you have, again, this kind of very weird reading and subjugation of the Islamic intellectual tradition to these Western standards. We need to really break free of this and read these texts in a way that is honest to the text itself and to the Islamic tradition and what it says about these things holistically. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam wa a'lam. Allah knows best.
Ustadh Fouad, keeping up with the text, you mentioned that you're in the introduction. I just got my text. Which part are you in right now focusing on? I just want to be keeping up with the reading.
Yeah, so we just got into the section on Sophists and the denial of knowledge. Sometimes they'll translate this section as just skepticism, because that's kind of what Imam al-Ghazali is going to be
The text I have.
on. So that's the text you have? Okay, so inshallah, I'll look and see because I'm not reading from that text. I'm just kind of translating from the Arabic. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Did you say something?
I said thank you.
Oh, yeah. Inshallah, I'll try to find where, and if anybody knows from the McCarthy book, where exactly, what page we're on, you can let Brother Faisal know. Any other questions? All right. So in summary, we can say two things. Number one, Imam al-Ghazali's engagement with all of this, first and foremost, he's trying to come into a proper understanding of knowledge and how one can delineate the different types of knowledge. And then recognizing that to have knowledge of a thing, i.e. rational justification for something, is extremely important, particularly when contrasted with human experience and being how we emotionally commit ourselves to things before we have made sense of them, and why we need to be wary of that. And then thirdly, we can say that he begins this investigation by beginning to look at how we can actually put these theoretical tools into practice by firstly seeing what is out there that one can actually say, I have absolute knowledge of, and in what manner are we going to be able to justify those claims? صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى، ولك الحمد إذا رضيت، ولك الحمد بعد الرضا، ولك الحمد كالذي نقول وخير مما نقول، ولك الحمد كالذي تقول، ولك الحمد على كل حال. اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل، اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. اللهم يا الله يا الله يا الله، بجاه أسماء الله وصفات الله ورسل الله وأنبياء الله والصالحين من عباد الله، اللهم اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا، نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم ارزقنا حسن الخاتمة، اللهم ارزقنا حسن الخاتمة. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. يا عالم السر منا لا تهتك الستر عنا، وعافنا واعف عنا وكلنا حيث كنا، واجعل آخر كلامنا لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم أيقظ قلوبنا ونبهنا من الغفلة عنك، اللهم أيقظ قلوبنا ونبهنا من الغفلة عنك. وصلي اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uplift all of you and provide you with everything that you need, those things that you know and those things that you don't know. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the best of this world and the best of the next, to allow this reading and our studies be a means by which He enters us into Jannah, and not a means by which we torment ourselves in this world and the next. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our families, to give cure to all of those who are sick, to give aid to all of those who are being oppressed all over the world, and to allow us to be amongst the people who are working for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following the legacy of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, and to forgive us our trespasses. Barakallahu feekum. I'll see you inshallah next week. And if anybody has anything and wants to reach out, by the way, on the WhatsApp group, please feel free to do so. Inshallah, we'll try and engage there as well. If it's very difficult and all this stuff feels like what's going on, just be patient, inshallah, and it will begin to make sense. All right. Assalamu alaikum. Good to see everybody.
وعليكم السلام.
والسلام.